Today, we're diving into something really significant, I think, especially for those of you looking closely at anti-colonial and decolonial thought.
Yeah, definitely.
We're aiming to get inside the world of Indigenous resurgence, looking specifically at the intellectual and, well, political framework of the Michi-Sagi Nishnabeg Nation.
That's right. And the material we're working with today, it's quite powerful because it really tries to shift the focus. It moves away from, the usual critiques of colonialism.
Which are important, of course.
Absolutely vital. But it moves towards the, let's say, active, positive practice of actually building indigenous worlds.
Yeah.
So for students, for scholars, this isn't just looking back. It's really a theory of freedom that comes from right inside indigenous philosophy itself.
Okay, so our job here is kind of like an architectural survey, right? We want to pull out the core blueprint for Indigenous freedom. We need to understand not just what this philosophy is, but crucially how it fuels and shapes the methods for radical resistance right now in the present.
Exactly. It's about understanding the difference between, say, just surviving colonialism and actively creating an authentic, self-determined indigenous reality.
And this whole philosophy, it's rooted in place, isn't it? And in present experience. It sounds incredibly intimate.
Profoundly intimate, yeah.
Which actually brings us straight to this very personal story that kind of anchors the whole thing.
Yeah.
The author talks about writing this really intense theoretical work while their kids are at swimming lessons.
Right, at Trent University.
Hmm?
A specific place with specific meaning.
Exactly. And every day they walk past the university's logo, which is, well, pretty stark. It shows Samuel Champlain's sword literally sticking into the heart of the territory.
Wow. Yeah, that really brings it home, doesn't it? How colonial violence isn't just history, it's like built into the landscape today.
But here's the twist. The author's children who've grown up with this deep cultural knowledge, they see that symbol completely differently.
How so?
They just casually say, they should change that. And when the author gets understandably upset, they're like, don't have a fit, Mom.
Huh. That casualness, that confidence.
Right. That ability to just see the settler violence, name it, reject it, but without being crushed by it. That's resurgence right there. It shows that this resistance isn't some abstract theory. It's alive. It's being passed on generationally.
And that lived experience, that resurgence, it connects directly back to a very sophisticated philosophical structure.
Hmm.
Which brings us to the central idea we really need to unpack today. Grounded normativity.
Or, as the Nishnabeg call it, Nishnabewin.
Exactly, Nishnabewin.
Okay, let's pin this down right away because it feels like everything else hinges on this, right?
It really does. Nishnabewin isn't just, a list of customs or traditions. It's the core intelligence system. It's the political theory, the whole ethical framework.
Yeah.
And all of it is generated in and through relationship with place, with the land.
So it's a knowledge system that's constantly being practiced, renewed, woven into just existing responsibly within creation.
That's a great way to put it, yes.
So for those of you, studying these political frameworks, the key thing is that this system generates ethics, generates governance sort of from the ground up. We need to get into the mechanics of this system to really see its vision of indigenous freedom.
Okay, let's look at that blueprint. When we talk about Nishnabewin, the sources use this amazing phrase. They call it the algorithm of the Nishnabeg world.
An algorithm. That's interesting. So not like a fixed constitution or a set of laws handed down?
Not at all. It's described as complex, interconnected, cyclical, and really importantly, a nonlinear network of relationships.
Okay, nonlinear. Western systems often aim for singularity, hierarchy, right? So this sounds deliberately complex, decentralized. How does that nonlinearity actually work for deciding what's ethical?
Well, it works because the foundation is the sanctity of the land and all of creation, what they call aki. All the core values, deep reciprocity, respect, non-interference, individual self-determination, freedom, they all radiate outwards from that fundamental dynamic relationship with place.
So the normativity is grounded because the laws or ethics come from observing and interacting respectfully with non-human relatives, like the rivers, the animals, the plants.
Precisely. If a decision might impact, say, the fish or the water or the maple trees, that impact isn't just an environmental issue tacked on at the end. It's a core moral responsibility to a relative.
That changes everything.
It does, and it shapes the whole goal of nationhood. The purpose isn't about, expanding territory or piling up capital. We'll get more into that later. But it's about protecting the integrity of the homelands for the generations to come.
And the core ethical rule is give more than you take.
Simple, but profound.
Yeah.
In everything you do, Strive to give more than you take.
Okay, so that commitment, non-coercion, reciprocity, must shape the relationship between the individual and the group pretty fundamentally. Let's look at freedom in this context.
Yeah, pre-colonial Anishinaabe society really fostered an incredible degree of individual self-determination. One of the most striking things, actually, is the status of children.
Oh, how so?
They were seen as full citizens. They had the same rights and therefore the same responsibilities as adults. That's why the sources describe them as being raised in a nest of freedom.
A nest of freedom. Wow, that speaks volumes about how learning and growing up happens. But if the goal is self-determination, how did they stop individual freedom from messing things up for the collective without using force or hierarchy?
Because hierarchy, authoritarian power, those things were just fundamentally against the grain of Anishinaabewin. The main way individuals governed themselves was through self-actualization, biskabiang, which means turning inward.
Turning inward.
Yeah. People were expected to spend their lives figuring out their own unique gifts, their responsibilities. And they did this through ceremony, through reflection, through really engaging deeply with their environment, with Aki.
So governing yourself was an internal journey, a reflective process, not something managed by an external bureaucracy.
Exactly. Discovering your purpose, your contribution, that was considered much more important than, say, the gender you happen to be born into, which is really crucial when we talk about gender later on. It's all about personal sovereignty.
Which makes any kind of external top-down control feel like an immediate attack on the whole political order.
Precisely. It's a system that seems designed for diversity, for resilience, because everyone's expected to bring their unique, self-found contribution to the whole community.
Okay, so if that's the system, what's the ultimate vision? What's the goal this whole political algorithm is working towards? The sources use the term kobeide.
Kobeide, it means a link in a chain. It signifies connection between generations, between nations, even between different states of being, physical and spiritual. It really defines the long-term vision of indigenous freedom they're actively building.
And this vision isn't just abstract theory, is it? The sources make it sound very tangible. It's about wanting their great-grandchildren to be able to live freely without harassment in their own homeland.
It is tangible. And in a colonial context, that vision is simple, but also incredibly radical. It means living without fear. It means knowing deep, felt respect in your bones. It means being able to dance with joy.
And crucially, having a healthy environment, right? One that provides physical food, but also emotional and spiritual well-being.
Exactly. It's a material and spiritual vision of collective wellness.
But this vision, this idea of kobeid, it's set against this backdrop of really intimate, profound loss, isn't it? A loss that shapes their present reality.
Oh, absolutely. To really get the stakes of resurgence, you have to appreciate the scale of the devastation. The author talks about driving across a territory with an elder, Doug Williams, and that experience becomes this lesson in, collapsing time.
How so?
Well, Doug Williams isn't just telling old stories. He's actively mapping the Anishinaabe present onto the land by pointing out what used to be there.
Like where Wendit villages were, old hunting grounds?
Exactly. The black oak savannas, the tall grass prairies that used to cover the area. Naming this past into the present, it's a way of positioning yourself right now in relation to your ancestors, in relation to all of creation.
It's refusing to let that memory just be history, something finished.
Right. But the material loss itself is just staggering. 4 centuries of systematic dispossession, being removed from most of their traditional territory, entire ecosystems collapsing.
And specific heartbreaking things, like eels and salmon vanishing from rivers over 100 years ago, rice beds destroyed, old-growth forests clear-cut.
Yeah, and the horrible irony of sacred places, even burial grounds, being turned into provincial parks for tourists, or having cottages built right on top of ancestors' remains.
That specific intimate destruction, losing the very non-human relatives that are part of the Anishinaabe algorithm, that's the context. It makes that commitment to kobeid feel less like a vague hope and more like a fierce, determined political plan.
Absolutely. #2 settler colonialism as a present structure of dispossession and extractivism.
Okay, so we have Anishinaabe as the algorithm for freedom. Its opposite, its antagonist, is settler colonialism. And for anyone studying decolonial frameworks, this distinction the sources make is vital. Settler colonialism isn't just a bad thing that happened in the past.
No, it's emphasized as a present structure of power right now.
Which is why Patrick Wolf's phrase is so central here, isn't it? That settler colonialism needs the perpetual disappearance of indigenous bodies for perpetual territorial acquisition. The structure always wants more land, always requires removal.
Always. And the sources argue that the colonial state deliberately uses its power to control the process of engagement. The consultations, the inquiries, land claims, negotiations.
It uses process to manage indigenous resistance, to manage their pain.
Exactly. But if the structure's fundamental goal is still dispossession, then those processes are basically rigged from the start.
The state controls the how to make sure what the outcome always preserves settler control and indigenous loss.
Right. And that's a really critical insight for resistance. If, say, a prime minister makes a seemingly hopeful gesture, like taking part in the ceremony, you have to test it.
Test it against the structure.
Yeah. Does that symbolic act actually change the underlying intent of dispossession? In Anishinaabe thought, intent really matters.
So if the answer is no, then resistance can't get fooled by what's basically political theater. The structure's intent is still hostile.
And that hostility really shows up in the economic engine of colonialism.
Yeah.
Extractivism. The author links this directly to Naomi Klein's work, defining it as the absolute opposite of Anishinaabe.
Klein calls extractivism a non-reciprocal, dominance-based relationship with the earth, a profound taking. It's the mindset that sees the world as just raw materials waiting to be turned into money.
And the indigenous critique makes it even sharper. Extraction is basically stealing. It's taking without consent, without care, without even knowing or acknowledging the long-term damage to the relationships that actually sustain life.
And the stealing is broad. It targets specific things.
4 categories, yeah. First, obviously, the theft of land and non-human relatives, which get relabeled as resources. Second, the theft of culture and knowledge, which gets taken, used out of context, commodified.
Third,
The theft of indigenous bodies and children, because those bodies hold the potential to keep the Anishinaabe system going, so they have to be controlled or removed. And fourth, stealing the future itself by destroying the possibility of co-aid of that generational continuity.
the sources use a really sharp example of this theft, taking indigenous technology.
Right. Settler culture grabbed the useful inventions,
Yeah.
the canoe, the kayak, snowshoes, absorbed them into its own story.
While actively erasing the people, the knowledge system, the whole ethical framework that actually created them. It's like taking the computer but trashing the operating system and firing the engineers.
Exactly. It's systemic violence.
Hmm.
And it demands a political alternative, which, for the Anishinaabe, is this radical anti-capitalism that's rooted in those Anishinaabewin values.
Mhm.
Deep reciprocity, respect, relationship, responsibility.
Which brings us to a fundamental economic difference. If Anishinaabe society didn't define wealth by capital, what did they value? What did they accumulate?
Something you can't really put on a balance sheet. Networks. Networks of meaningful, fluid, collective, and individual relationships of trust. In that pre-contact world, with its changes and sometimes hardships, survival depended entirely on how strong and deep those relationships were, not on how much stuff you hoarded.
So what about personal greed then? If relationships are the real wealth?
Greed, accumulating too much stuff or capital, was seen as a direct attack on the health of the whole community. And even deeper, it was understood to actually offend the spirits of the plants and animals, the relatives providing sustenance. It broke that core rule: give more than you take.
That distinction is so important, especially for students looking at political economy. When Anishinaabewan says Aki is not capital and Kiwe, woman body, is not capital, that's a fundamental intellectual challenge. Calling relatives resources is a basic mistake with huge consequences.
Huge. We see the consequences: lost ecosystems, unstable weather, the destruction of the relational web itself. And the sources push back hard against any idea that this was somehow less developed.
Right. They weren't less developed. They were sophisticated makers of food systems, clothes, ethics, technology, governance, not just consumers.
And they had the know-how, the capacity to develop something like capitalism. But they consciously, repeatedly chose not to. That choice reflected their deep ethical commitments, grounded in Anishinaabewan.
Okay, so settler colonialism steals land, Aki. Now, the sources argue really powerfully that this theft is structurally, fundamentally gendered. How does that work? How does the colonial structure shift its focus from the land to the body, especially women's bodies, and to spirit queer, to askew people?
Well, it's not really a shift, because the two are totally interconnected. Colonialism attacks indigenous bodies through violence, murder, poverty, criminalization, precisely because those bodies hold the political orders, the relationships that tie indigenous people to their land.
So to get the land, you have to erase the people who embody that land's sovereignty.
Exactly. And this is so crucial for understanding things like the health crises in indigenous communities today. When we talk about social ills, addiction, illness, mental health issues, The sources insist these aren't the actual disease.
Their symptoms.
They're symptoms, manifestations of the deep hurt and trauma from the ongoing structural violence of dispossession. So if political efforts only try to fix the symptoms, tackle the addiction, the poverty, without challenging the root cause, the dispossession itself.
Then those efforts end up just propping up the settler colonial structure.
Right, this ongoing violence is met by this political act of refusal. Audra Simpson's work is key here. Refusing colonial domination, refusing the heteropatriarchy it imposes, refusing to be co-opted by institutions like universities.
But within Anishinaabewin, refusal isn't just negative, is it? It's always generative.
Always. It's never just saying no. It's the living, breathing practice of the alternative. The story of the Hoof Nation is a perfect example of this kind of non-coercive relational refusal.
The Hoof Nation. Deer, moose, caribou.
Yeah. The story goes, when the Nishnabeg were over-harvesting them, the Hoof Nation simply refused. They refused to be taken. They left the territory.
Wow, that's a form of governance right there. Not a human law, but the non-human relative exercising its own sovereignty.
Exactly. It forced the humans to recognize they'd broken the relationship, to recognize their ethical failure, and to establish a new treaty based on real reciprocity and respect.
And that kind of relationship, that kind of sovereignty, is exactly what the colonial state aimed to destroy with things like the Canadian Indian Act.
Absolutely. The whole Canadian nation-building project was obsessed with creating moral and responsible citizens defined by European heteropatriarchal monogamous Christian marriage.
And the sources show the level of control was just intense. Indian agents had huge power to police this morality.
They could punish any perceived disobedience, any deviation from colonial gender or sexual norms. They could take away treaty payments, deny food rations, or, maybe worst of all, take children away to residential schools. There were literally government filing systems labeled immorality on reserves.
That level of bureaucratic control over people's intimate lives is chilling. The colonization of the body was incredibly personal, invasive, and early laws in the Indian Act reinforced this, right? Like the prostitution laws from 1879.
Yeah, those laws specifically included indigenous homes, wigwams, in the definition of houses of prostitution, which basically declared indigenous homes inherently disorderly.
Which then legally justified surveillance, interference, and removing children for neglect. The assault on Cree, on women and indigenous bodies, was baked into the system.
And this intense policing was needed because pre-colonial societies often had very different, much more diverse understandings of gender and sexuality. We should clarify the term 2SQ for listeners. It refers to two-spirit and queer people whose roles were often integral and valued.
Right. In Nishnabeg society, identity was more about your clan, your name, your personal gifts, your self-determination, your agency, not some rigid male-female binary.
Yeah, we know historically that this diversity was deliberately targeted.
Hmm?
You have French Jesuits like Lafitau boasting back in 1724 about suppressing indigenous queer relationships, forcing people into colonial norms, generating this deep, lasting shame even before the main residential school era.
Which underscores why creating new decolonized stories is so critical now. The sources really stress critiquing literature that might accidentally reproduce colonial ideas about masculinity, and instead telling stories where trans kids are seen as loving, brilliant, queer, indigenous people, affirming that diversity is actually the nation's strength.
And finally, there's the internal discussion about regulating women's bodies in ceremony specifically, excluding menstruating women.
Right. Sometimes that's framed as women being too powerful during that time.
But the critical view in the sources sees this regulation, however it's framed, as an imposition on agency, on sovereignty, on self-determination.
Because it uses a gender binary, an exclusion, to stop certain people from connecting with the spiritual realm directly.
That's the critique. It feels like an imposed patriarchal rule, whatever the intention. The proposed solution, flowing from Nishnabewin's principles, is to actually remove the gender binary and these exclusionary rules from ceremony altogether.
And center ceremony instead on consent, diversity, non-interference, and individual intent.
Exactly, reinforcing that sovereign link between the person and the spiritual.
Okay, so we've got the philosophy, the critique of the opposing structure. Now we shift to the active work, building the indigenous world. And this starts with education, right? Or akino.
Akino, which literally means something like to point toward and take direction from aki. Land is pedagogy.
So Aki the land, all of creation is the curriculum. It's not about standardized tests or school bells.
Not at all. It's about creating the right context for lifelong, intimate learning that happens through continuous, reciprocal relationship with creation. The intelligence comes from being there, basically.
And the prime example of this Nishnabeg intelligence generated through relationship is the story of how maple sugar came to be told from the perspective of a gender nonconforming child, Binujina.
It's a fantastic story. It contains the whole methodology
Let's walk through it. So Binujin is out walking.
and engages in step one. Learning through observation. They notice a squirrel, a jidamu, nibbling a maple branch, getting sustenance.
Okay, observation. Then step 2, embodiment and creativity. Binujin doesn't just write it down.
No. They engage physically. They use a rock to make a cut in the tree, figure out how to use a little cedar shunt to collect the sap. It's active invention, driven by curiosity.
But they're also working within that ethical framework, right? Step 3, reciprocity.
Absolutely crucial. Eugene knows to offer Sima tobacco to the spirit of the maple tree. It's an act of respect, of consent, setting up that balanced relationship, sustenance in exchange for recognition.
When Binjini takes this unknown sap home, and the mother
Responds with love and trust, not suspicion or prohibition. She lets the child experiment. They cook meat in the sap. And together, through observation, they figure out reduction. The water boils off, leaving the sugar.
It's such a powerful story. It completely disrupts those linear colonial ideas about how knowledge gets made. It shows Indigenous knowledge generation is continuous, relational, ongoing. It affirms this is how we learn. We've always done it this way.
Exactly. And this whole model of learning, of generating knowledge, is embodied by the figure of Nanabush.
The trickster figure, positioned as the ultimate model for Nishnabeg intelligence,
Yeah.
the first researcher, basically.
You could say that. Nanabush isn't some detached academic in an office. The origin story has Nanabush traveling the whole world, twice, visiting every single nation, human and non-human,
Why?
to learn. And crucially, to create face-to-face reciprocal relationships with all of creation.
And the methods are different from today's academic ones.
Very different. Nanabush didn't write grant proposals, didn't need ethics approval from a board.
Knowledge came through doing.
Through doing. Visiting, singing, dancing, watching, reflecting, dreaming, trying things out. For anyone studying methodology, the key difference is Nanabush prioritizes that deep face-to-face relationship, that embodied experience over detached study. It's about generating knowledge that serves the whole web of life, not just abstract ideas.
And this relational way of being extends even into art, into aesthetics. The sources talk about Indigenous aesthetics, repetition, duality, layering, abstraction being political acts.
Yeah, they're used to encode work, to cut through the noise of colonialism, and to enact that affirmative generative refusal we talked about.
And there's a key difference made between abstraction and extraction.
A vital one. Extraction is stealing, taking something out of the relationships that give it meaning. Abstraction, though, is about strategically shifting relationality through art, design, story to reveal new meaning, all within that context of grounded normativity.
And a powerful example of this art as resurgence is Robert Hull's installation, Paris Ojibwa.
Right. Who literally reconstructs an 1840s Parisian salon, but places it in Michisagic territory. It's about transforming the tragic history of Michisagic artists like Wosigi Zigukwe, who died while traveling in Europe.
How does he transform it?
Through layering. There are painted panels showing figures returning home. The names of the deceased artists cycle through. The soundscape shifts from water to drums to an honor song.
So he takes this dark history, but instead of a victim narrative, he creates a sacred story, an honor song. The sources call it a physical intervention of Nishnabebin internationalism.
Exactly. And it works with a kind of opaqueness, a coded quality that refuses the colonial gaze, just asserts Nishnabeg presence and sovereignty.
Okay, so these individual acts, the art, the self-determination, the knowledge, they're like stars, but they need to connect.
They need to connect, which brings us to the idea of constellations of coexistence.
Constellations of coexistence, networks for liberation.
That's the idea. Individual acts of resurgence, like stars connecting with others, all operating from that grounded normativity, forming these networks, these flight paths, out of the settler colonial reality.
And the sources point to the sky when Nishnabeg look at the Big Dipper. They see Guchiojig, the Fisher constellation.
And the story Dukiojig is one of collective action: fisher, lynx, otter, wolverine, working together for survival. It's Nishnabewin, encoded right there in the stars. Opaque, coded, powerful.
This model really changes how you think about solidarity, doesn't it? The sources challenge the common focus on seeking recognition from the state or from white allies.
Yeah, they argue that focus is fundamentally limiting. Constellations of coexistence demand something different.
Building deep ethical relationships with other communities facing oppression, like the Black radical tradition.
Exactly. This is where Anishinaabe becomes active political accountability. It raises really crucial contemporary questions like how is Anishinaabe nationhood in a place like Toronto, Gucci, and Cheekiwong accountable to the struggles of Black people living in that same territory?
Anishinaabe compels an ethical duty to support other nations' governance, their jurisdiction, to make sure Anishinaabe presence doesn't accidentally reproduce systems that harm Black people or restrict their lives.
Precisely. The ethics have to apply reciprocally, relationally, or the whole system breaks down.
And the ultimate example given of this kind of radical resurgence, combining refusal, coexistence, asserting territory, is the PKOLS reclamation.
PKOLS, yeah, this was back in 2013. The Asai UTW Nation and their allies just decided to walk up Mount Douglas near Victoria, BC, and put up a sign with its original name, PKOLS.
And the key thing was, they didn't ask permission from the city.
No permission asked. It was direct, collective, transformative action. It wasn't framed as victimhood. It didn't seek white approval. It refused the politics of grief. It was planned specifically to avoid misrepresentation.
It sounds like it was just a joyful, powerful assertion of Indigenous presence and authority, a demonstration that they're already governing the land.
Exactly. It was an act of sovereignty that simply is, rather than one that asks permission to be. Hashtag Hout Outro. So if we try to pull together this whole vast intellectual journey we've been on today, the core of radical resurgence really seems to be generative refusal.
That turning inward Biskabiang to focus intensely on generating Indigenous ways of living, rooted completely in Anishinaabe.
Right, and that move, centering Indigenous life and knowledge, fundamentally shifts the power dynamic with the settler state, because it demonstrates this self-contained, powerful alternative already exists.
So Indigenous freedom, according to this thinking, isn't something granted by the state. It actually depends on dismantling settler colonialism as a structure.
Yes, and this huge political journey towards freedom, it doesn't start in a courtroom or parliament. It starts in the most intimate everyday practice of relationship and recognition.
Which brings us back to that Anishinaabe greeting, an anin. Elder Doug Williams understands it as meaning, I see your light, or I see your essence.
It's an acknowledgement that immediately puts you in a spiritual context. It commits you to recognizing the unique, sovereign value in the other being, whether human or not.
It forces you to see their Aki, their K-way. So as you think about this deep dive, integrating it into how you understand anti-colonial thought, maybe consider the implications of that intimate practice. What if that intention to reciprocally recognize the core essence, the light, and everyone and everything in the web of life, what if that became the foundation for collective political action, for diplomacy?
What kind of world could that generate?
What kind of political power could come from centering that simple, deep commitment to seeing life's essence above all else? That's your deep dive for today.